For those of you who watch my channel regularly, I think nothing I'm about to say will really surprise you. I regard so-called white guilt as problematic, not because it's a form of guilt. I actually think guilt can be quite a positive, motivating force in people's lives. I always make fun of myself with this. I always say my values are very Bronze Age. They're very unfashionable. I know that these days people think you should never feel guilty, you should never feel bad about yourself. I think it's great. I'm pro-guilt. Did something terrible in your life? Feel guilty about it. Great. Learn from your sense of guilt. Learn from your sense of shame. Change. Take on a new direction. I mean, I think guilt can be something wonderful as part of the human experience. My views are decidedly unfashionable in 2017. But look, the white guilt phenomenon, I've encountered it when I was working on First Nations peoples and languages. So Cree, Ojibwe, languages and politics that in America they would call Native American, in Canada we call First Nations. I encountered it in many different forms in Southeast Asia. People dealing with the history, the long shadow of America's involvement in Vietnam, Cambodia, in wars there and what have you. And I mean, it's not meaningless. I'm not going to come out here and say, white guilt is, like many things in this world, you can recognize that something is deeply flawed and problematic, and at the same time recognize that the people involved with it are actually motivated to make the world a better place. That's definitely the case with white guilt, both with the people who experience it and with the people who kind of weaponize it, who kind of turn it into something they use to humiliate others and carry on left-wing political discourse. These are people, however misguided, trying to make the world a better place. And there's a lot of that goes on, of course, in religion. You get a lot of people joining religious groups trying to make the world a better place, and they end up making it worse. This kind of very ethically loaded misconception. Now look, so what is the problem with white guilt? I've already said the problem. The problem isn't the guilt as such. I'm not. No. I'm not opposed to that. I think it's really profoundly philosophically misleading to look at this world and build your ethics on what you would have done 30 years ago, 300 years ago, 500 years ago. Why is it so misleading? First and foremost, because on an emotional level, the people who indulge in this way of thinking, people who look back even at the American War in Vietnam or the slave trade, the involvement of, let's say, the French Empire in the slave trade, people look back at that and say, oh, no, I'm superior to those people because if I were in their position, I would have never made that decision. At the same time that people perceive white guilt as self-abnegation or, self-criticism from white people laying themselves low, in reality, in a more subtle sense, what they're doing is declaring themselves in a totally meaningless sense morally superior. It's really based on an attachment, a sanctimonious. That's the word I was looking for. It is a truly sanctimonious sentiment. And I've never met someone who responded to white guilt by getting motivated to look at what were the factors, what were the reasons why their ancestors, theoretically their ancestors, but why people in centuries past or even in decades past made these decisions. And so it seems to lend itself to this kind of two-dimensional reduction of history. To, on the one hand, just serving as a self-congratulatory award that, you're supposedly so much better than these people who live these other circumstances. And I mean, so there's the element of self-righteousness, which is a very ugly pairing with ignorance. Now, if you're going to study history, if you're going to study politics, really this is about politics, but we're talking about politics in the past tense here, you've really got to practice having sympathy for the devil, because sympathy will lead you to productive new research and analysis. And this kind of sanctimonious self-congratulation that's involved with white guilt will not. On a two-dimensional level, dealing with it in this ultra-simplified way, It seems like the most ridiculous thing in the world that in the 20th century, the American intelligence service, including the CIA, became deeply involved in international drug trafficking. American spies became international dope dealers, heroin and cocaine. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is an incredibly well-documented fact, including, by the way, extensive hearings from the U.S. House of Congress, what have you. It's so easy to look back. I mean, especially, maybe you're a tourist who goes to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Look back and say, this is a terrible stain on American democracy. How could anyone ever do this? I would never do this. This is unthinkable to me, etc. It is unthinkable because you're looking at it with absolutely zero historical context. I don't think anyone at the CIA ever sat down and said, hey, I got a great idea. Let's turn this intelligence organization into a dope dealing outfit. Here's what did happen. France was defeated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And that was a disaster and a calamity for France because contrary to popular belief, the leadership of France, including Charles de Gaulle, wanted the French Empire to go on forever. They handed over control of Indochina, French control of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, to the United States. That was, as I recall, at the time when the CIA was still just being organized out of the post-World War II Black Ops Division, the OSS, the various intelligence services. So I think it is not quite accurate to refer to them as the CIA at that moment. I may be off by a couple of years. So American military intelligence, under one heading or another, has handed over to them a fully functional, self-funding, dope-dealing system. The French very intentionally designed their colonies to have a self-funding secret service, and they were hoping to eventually have a self-funding military and a self-funding occupation built on a very poorly understood imitation of the British Empire in India maybe a century earlier. So is this an excuse? No. If you were the director of the CIA and someone told you, hey, we've just inherited this functioning, ongoing opium smuggling ring that's, created, devised, and operated by French intelligence in Indochina, what would you do? Well, it's a mysterious thing about history that we should all learn from. What would motivate the Americans to take over that drug dealing operation? I can tell you right now, the belief that they would do it better. It's profoundly appealing to human beings. At every stage in the history of slavery, whether you're looking at the earliest days when the transatlantic slave trade is a new idea, or later when it's become entrenched and culturally accepted, the easiest thing in the world was for a French colony to look across the fence at a Spanish colony and say, those people are the barbarians. Those are the guys doing a bad job. And if you read primary source documents from almost any period in the history of slavery, this may be true, you could even say any period of any colonial empire, you'll always find them looking across the fence at their rivals and fastening onto very specific ethical differences. So I can remember reading the French in Haiti had an incredibly brutal system of slavery, by the way, even by the standards of the Caribbean. Looking across the fence, so to speak, at Cuba and saying, in Cuba, the slave masters use dogs. They have hunting dogs to smell the slaves and chase them, and also to torture them, to have the dogs biting. And we don't do that. This is civilization versus savagery. And on the other side, there were Spanish-speaking colonies there. I'm sorry, I don't remember offhand the names, that looked at Haiti and looked down their noses at how brutal the system of slavery was in Haiti, the French colony. Because among other things, the slaves in the French colony were quite eager to escape to become slaves in the more humane conditions of the nearby Spanish-speaking colonies. There was quite a lot of that going on. There were slaves who had to choose between more than one system of slavery, more than one slave society. It's always so easy to look down your nose at your competitors. And it's always so easy to convince yourself that no matter how bad or evil a thing is, you will do it better than them. You will do it better than they would or they did. The people who were there before you, the people on the other side of the fence. I'm absolutely certain that the Americans took over control of Indochina, of the French Empire, and Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, with one simple certainty. However bad a job they might do, at least they would do better than the French. Yes, taking over an opium smuggling operation might be a bad and evil thing, but we can't be any worse than those guys. At least we'll do a better job than them. And it did have profound long-term consequences. I think in a really meaningful sense, the later scandals like Iran-Contra, the Iran-Contra affair, the various scandals that exposed American military, American CIA involvement in either cocaine trafficking, opium trafficking, or both. Specific deals of trading drugs for guns and supporting, covert ops and paramilitary groups, these kinds of arrangements in South America, in Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. I think in a very meaningful sense, they're all connected to the precedent that was set at the end of World War II, after Dien Bien Phu, when the French handed over control of their operation to the Americans. So the French imitated the British, specifically the dope-dealing British Empire in India. The Americans imitated the French. And I do have sympathy for the devil. When I look at the decisions made by people like Nixon and Mao Zedong, I do enough research so that I can understand what their reasons were. Because the point of sympathy, it's a very interesting contrast, sympathy versus guilt. I think both can play a positive role in your life. I'm not here to say guilt is all bad. I think that the real value of sympathy is as an analytical tool. It's to draw you into a more meaningful understanding of what the problem is. I don't sympathize with Richard Nixon so I can weep on my pillow thinking about what a hard time he had when he pushed the button to drop all those bombs on Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. No, of course. In an obvious sense, Richard Nixon was a really despicable person in history, for sure. I sympathize with him so that I can understand what his reasons were for the decisions that he made. And once you understand those reasons, you don't feel guilt. You don't feel white guilt. You don't feel Chinese guilt. You don't feel Japanese guilt. You don't feel guilt. Instead, you have a level of understanding, and it becomes apparent to you that if you were in that person's position, maybe, just maybe, you would have made the same decision that they did.